Hello everybody, back again. I'm cousin Vinny Agnello, and this is my critically acclaimed national novel, The Devil's Glove, a spiritual classic, as you will see. This is what we're going to call the Bedtime with Cousin Vinny series. It started last night, and we read the first 9 pages, or actually 8 pages. And we're going to start off today on page 9 and enjoy yourself for a wild and crazy and enjoyable ride. Here is my classic, The Devil's Glove. Since Billy was old in baseball terms, time was no longer his ally, and this was the stress of his life. This stress was compounded by his poor performance in his first major league game last night. Just when everyone was convinced that he had overcome his throwing woes, he somehow regressed. His overall play, especially his defense, was abysmal, and everyone now knew that Billy was on his way back to the minor leagues. Most likely, because of his age, he would never get another chance at that proverbial brass ring. For many years now, Michael had feared how Billy would react if things did not go right for him. He was always afraid that the boy would go off the deep end, and this morning, that fear circulated throughout his entire body. He knew the boy had to be crushed by the demotion, and he wanted so badly to comfort him during this painful period, but when he went to look for him after the game, he was nowhere to be found. He recalled how he had searched the stadium in vain the previous night, only to find the boy's street clothes. Where had he gone in his uniform? What if he didn't leave the stadium? These unanswered questions made his stomach drop, and it was a sickening sight to see this proud old man crumpled down on the floor, bawling his eyes out and praying that nothing had happened to his boy. He muttered to himself in anguish, "Why can't that boy realize that there's more to him to love than how well he plays the game?" Michael pulled himself up off the floor and got dressed. Momentarily, he was out the door, replaying in his mind all the events that took place the night before. As he drove his car toward Comiskey Park, he recalled his conversation with Billy before the game. The boy had seemed more or less at peace with himself. The anger and resentment that had surfaced during his last years in the minor league seemed to have disappeared. He became a team player once again. That phase he went through back in the minors of cheering against his own teammates was now just a memory. And as far as Michael could tell, the only player that he wished misfortune upon was Hector Rodriguez, the White Sox's Cuban third baseman, who, as far as Billy was concerned, stood between himself and stardom. As he maneuvered his vehicle through city traffic, he recalled how radiant Billy looked when Rodriguez pulled up lame after stealing second base. This was the moment that Billy had waited his entire life for. It was the culmination of his dream. Tears flowed down his cheeks as he recalled how Billy had taken the field the night before and how he had glowed when his name was announced over the public address system. Suddenly, Michael became aware of the tragedy that had been staged for the world to see. Billy Green, a kid who had never been quite good enough for the major leagues, had his glaringly obvious deficiencies exposed on his opening night. This should have been a joyous occasion for the young man who had dedicated his entire life to the pursuit of this one opportunity. But there was some kind of trickery taking place here, Michael thought. From Michael's perspective, there was just no other explanation for it. He ruminated over the strange sequence of events that took place during that game and had one overwhelming thought about Billy's performance. As soon as he stepped into the limelight, he immediately played down to the minor league form he'd always been known for. his vastly improved skills of late that had finally earned him his chance at making the big club had strangely disappeared. Now, how could that have possibly happened overnight, Michael thought. This was a complete mystery to the people who followed his prolonged and prodigious rise as a ball player. Some would have written it off as a case of the opening night jitters. But Michael, a very religious man, was sure that it was something much more sinister. He believed in good and evil, and his religious upbringing convinced him that there was such a thing as a deceiver in this world. Satan was God's nemesis, and he saw plenty of examples of his handiwork. World War II was littered with them. The extermination camps, those horrible pictures he saw of the concentration camp victims, and the horrendous treatment of prisoners of war in general, had convinced him that Satan had a very strong hold on this earth. After mulling it over, he thought Satan had to be to blame for Billy's performance problems. Who else, he reasoned, was callous enough to rake Billy over the coals and humiliate him in front of all those people? There was no way to change Michael's mind on this matter. It was a moot point. Aware of how fragile the boy's ego had become in recent years, he could do nothing but pray that this devastating blow was not the catalyst that pushed him over the edge. Watching him commit not one, but 3 errors on routine ground balls was all the evidence that he needed to conclude that Billy and the scouts who brought him up to the White Sox had been misled. The boy was obviously still not ready for the major leagues. In fact, until this year, Michael was convinced that the boy was destined to be a career minor leaguer. But almost overnight, the boy's skills started to improve. Defense was no longer a deficiency, and suddenly there was interest in the boy as a major leaguer when there hadn't been any interest in years. In addition, what was to be thought of those dreams he had? What kind of dreams were they? These were the predominant questions that filled his mind as he flashed back to the events of the past evening. As he reached the ballpark, a glimmer of hope came into his eyes as he thought for a second that Billy might have gone home to his parents' house. He reasoned that maybe Billy was so embarrassed by his performance during the game that he left immediately, avoiding any confrontations that might have occurred with his teammates in the showers or in the locker room. But as quickly as that thought came into his head, it was rejected. The reason being that he knew deep down inside that Billy's father would have been anything but consoling toward his son, especially after learning of the demotion. He knew that Billy didn't have a strong enough constitution to deal with the callousness of his birth father. Michael cautiously entered the ballpark and observed nothing unusual. He pondered the thought of Billy leaving the park and getting drunk at a local tavern. But that didn't explain why he didn't change his clothes. Due to his poor performance during the game, he doubted seriously that he would go out in uniform and draw extra attention to himself. From all the years he'd spent with him, he knew for sure that Billy wasn't a glutton for punishment. And only a glutton for punishment would go out in game uniform after that performance. As everyone knows, Chicago fans have a long history of being very nasty to their fallen sports heroes. He knew Billy wouldn't subject himself to that. Still feeling uneasy but needing to do something constructive with his time, he decided to take a walk around the field and pick up some litter. In the process of performing this chore, he glanced up toward the stadium seats. What he saw shocked the hell out of him. Hanging by the neck from the upper deck, dressed in his White Sox uniform and wearing his green shoes and unique green glove, was Billy Green. Michael was in no way ready for this, and he grimaced in pain. His worst fear had become a reality. He stared up at him in disbelief and then let out the most tragic moan that the old ballpark had ever heard expelled. It was a dying groan, very primeval, the kind that was repeated too many times throughout the history of this world. It was the worst kind of agony, the kind of personal anguish that was never meant to be felt. It was as unnatural as a father outliving his son. The overwhelming sadness of this occasion cannot be properly expressed here. Hanging by the neck from the upper deck of that stadium was the extinguished dreams of a new generation. A part of the old man died with the son whom he never biologically fathered, but whose spirit was eternally joined with his. He became painfully aware that the rest of his days on this earth would be nothing more than an extended death sentence. For the rest of his life, he would never experience the joy of love again. Michael couldn't stop crying. The tears flowed down his face as if someone had left a faucet on. He thought about those mean-spirited fans who heckled Billy the night before. Those fans got what they wanted, although they would never know about it. He would see to that. They wanted to see the kid break, but he'd take away any pleasures that they might have received by knowing that they had succeeded in pushing the kid over the edge. They would never know they broke him. He had one overwhelming, impulsive thought, and that was to conceal his body so no one would ever laugh at Billy again. He couldn't bear with the shame of knowing that the son that he loved the most in the world had taken his own life. So he decided to take the body and bury it right on the stadium grounds. He knew deep in his heart that the boy would approve of his decision, because he was now bitterly sure how much the boy was willing to sacrifice for the game he loved. So Michael decided to keep the boy in the stadium that he worked his entire life to play in. The only question in his mind was where to bury him. He needed a place where the body would never be discovered. And then he thought of it. There was such a place. He gently cut down Billy's body and then struggled to carry it throughout the maze of seats, tunnels, and out onto the field. He knew of an old empty storage shed out past the fence in left field and decided that this would be Billy's final resting place. It took some time to get there, but eventually he did. His overworked muscles were so relieved when he finally set Billy's body down that he immediately collapsed onto the ground and gasped for air. He stared over at Billy's body and tried to brainwash himself into believing that he was just asleep, but could not convince himself of this fantasy. He then wondered if he could survive the intense manual labor of digging a grave using only a pick and a shovel. After catching his breath, he decided to gather some supplies for this endeavor and traversed a short distance to another storage shed. He opened the shed where the extra field tarpaulin was stored and cut off a large piece. He thought, thank God for this extra field tarp, because without it, Billy would have to be exposed to the elements. And I couldn't bear with that. He scanned through the many tools that were hanging from the various metal hooks that protruded from the wooden walls of the shed, and finally located a roll of duct tape. He quickly grabbed the tape, shoved it into his pants pocket, and proceeded to drag the large piece of field tarpaulin over the dew-wet grass toward the old empty shed. When he arrived there, he noticed that he forgot to grab a shovel that was grab a shovel and race back to the tarp shed to retrieve one. He grabbed a shovel that was leaning against the wall and carried it back over to where the body awaited. Upon arrival, he rolled Billy's body, uniform and all, into the tarp. He took some extra time to wrap Billy's prized green glove, which was covered with all that unique artwork, in some newspapers he found in the shed. The paper would help keep the glove from disintegrating in the ground. He went out of his way to make sure Billy and his possessions would stay dry for eternity. After it was wrapped, he